Alrighty, welcome everybody. This is the History Has Eyes on You 6. This is our sixth talk in this whole series. And we really, tonight's going to be our, I guess, the toughest subject we've dealt with so far, even though we've dealt with a lot of different subjects, um, which is going to be talking about colorism in the Latinx community. And so we're going to be discussing how colorism and Blackness is affected in the Latino community here. And we have several speakers here that are going to be speaking to the different contexts of how this works out and how this plays out. And so um, just so that you know that this is an event that is sponsored by Jade Publishing, and Jade Publishing has been sponsoring this since we started this. And so Jade Publishing itself publishes multilingual books of all kinds, they mostly publish internationally, trilingual books as well, from children's books to fiction to essay collections to poetry. And they also run the Latino Book Review. And the Latino Book Review has its own podcasts as well. And so we're just kind of an arm of what they're doing there. And of course, they're my publisher. They published my last two books. And then my next book should be coming out this summer through them as well. So this subject in itself is, we're talking about what's happening now, especially with with the trial right now on Derek Chauvin's trial, and we have the shooting that just occurred. And so our speakers are going to speak a lot more on that. So on all that's happening as of right now. And but we want to really look at, with this panel in particular, the how Blackness is really viewed within the community and how that really plays out when we're looking at these subjects, which is a very tough subject that we don't deal with a lot, right? So when I was young, I always got the Prieto from my grandparents, and that was said obviously in a term of endearment, but it has this effect, right, as we grow older. And so for me, there's always been that to it, right? And especially when I'm, not in, South Texas. I've been mistaken for Black. I've been mistaken for Indian from India, and so many other different things, which I think a lot of Latinos can identify with, right? So this is a subject that is ended up also in my work as well. Characters dealing with whiteness, characters dealing with Blackness, and how this plays out within our own community, which is also a subject that hasn't really gotten a lot of play in the media or even in a lot of different other places. But so I just wanted to go say that this is going to be one of those. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about the rules. So make sure that when everybody says you have your mics muted, we're going to, and so if you have questions, you can put them into the chat and we will get to them toward the end, at the end after our presenters have presented their work. And so, but if you, like I said, if you have one and you just want to kind of remember it, you can go ahead and put it in the chat, and I'll go through those as well. When we get to the Q&A, you guys can either speak up or write one into the chat box. Now you can use a little hand, if you want to raise your hand, or there's lots of, you can use the reactions so that we can do something like that so that I can call on you. So I'm going to go ahead and start with introduce our first presenter. Dr. Daniel Delgado is going to be speaking on Afraid of Our Own Shadows, Colorism and Anti-Blackness in Mexican-American Politics. And so Dr. Daniel is an associate professor at Texas A&M San Antonio. His research is focused on three areas: Latinx experience with the processes of racialization, understanding how race and social space are intertwined, and how institutional structures shape the reproduction of white supremacy. Some of his most recent research addresses how colorblind racism in macro and meso level government structures shapes police decision-making. In 2019, he published a co-edited book entitled Latino Peoples in New America, Racialization and Resistance, and he is working on a book addressing the everyday racial politics experienced by Latinx people. And so he also is a native of San Antonio. So I want to go ahead and welcome Daniel.
Thank you, Chris. Give me 1 second to share my screen. All right, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. I want to thank you, Chris, and everybody for being here today. And I also want to thank my fellow co-panelists for being here. I feel very privileged to be part of this conversation. It's a very difficult one, to say the least, but it is nonetheless a necessary one, especially given some of the issues that we're facing today, not just in the Mexican American or Latinx communities, but also our Black and African American brothers and sisters are facing in their own communities. So I think it's very timely that we're having this conversation. So thank you for putting this together. So I'll just start with the title. I titled it "Afraid of Our Own Shadow" because I think that our shadows are part of us, but they're also a part of us that we often don't sort of really think about or investigate. And we're not very conscious of the ways in which it's connected to us. And so today, I really wanted to focus on those sort of parts of who we are as Mexican ancestry or Mexican American people, and the ways in which we sort of navigate and negotiate those racial identities that are actually tied to us, yet we don't often conceptualize or interpret them as being so. And so with that said, I have 3 sort of research questions that I wanted to use to orient us. Now, I'm a social scientist, so I have a very sort of formulaic approach here, so bear with me, those of you that feel like it's too rigid. I apologize, but I certainly am open to having more conversation later on. But so the first question I have is, how do Mexican Americans conceptualize their own racial identities in relation to other available racial identities? And so in particular here was, in my research, I found that a lot of the Mexican American people that I interviewed and spoke with often would talk about their identities in very complex and multifaceted ways. So it wasn't just, I'm this or that. It was, well, sometimes I'm this, sometimes I'm that. And in particular, what I found was that they would sort of narrate their racial identities or racial and ethnic identities as multifaceted. And one of the things that really made me think about is my second question, which is, how is whiteness, blackness, and Mexicanness interconnected for Mexican Americans, right? So really what I was trying to understand is the way in which these racial identities are functioning for Mexican Americans. And then finally, with that said, my last question is, where does Mexican American racial identity exist if this is the case? That is, if these identities are connected or not connected, where does it leave Mexican Americans' racial identity? This is what I'm looking at here. So moving forward, I just want to talk briefly, I'll be very brief about my data. I'm happy to elaborate more on it later on, and particularly the methodologies as well, if someone's interested. But for now, have 67 semi-structured interviews. 32 men were part of that and 35 women. These interviews were about an hour to 2.5 hours long each. They were all transcribed, and some of them had also follow-up interviews that lasted anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half. 33 of these interviews were from San Antonio and 34 were from Phoenix. And all of the participants were middle class. Now, I can talk about how I organized them into the middle class and how I chose them, if you would like to know sort of how I identified middle class status for them. The other data set that I'm going to talk about, or the related data, is the data I have on the Tejano Monument, which is in Austin, Texas. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the 5 monument plaques that are, they're interpretive plaques on the front of the monument, as well as the monument structure. And I use 3 different sort of forms of data analysis. Again, I'm happy to get into those as necessary, but for the sake of time, I'm going to keep moving forward. So what I have here is 3 quotes that sort of spoke to the sort of ways in which the Mexican Americans that I interviewed sort of interpreted their racial identities. And the first one is Suzanne. I'm going to start with her statements. She says, well, see, okay, I know racially the census says I'm white because for statistical purposes, I'm racially white because it's either black or white. but I don't identify myself as racially white. So it seems on the surface sort of, if you read it, very slowly, it feels a little convoluted, right? It's like, well, I'm not white, but I'm white, right? Um, so I think what's going on here and what we have to think about is that there is a very sort of purposeful sort of boundary making that's happening here by Suzanne. And she's distancing herself from two different identities. And in particular, what she's doing is she's also recognizing that she's also being cornered into another identity. So let me read Ricardo's statements, which is the second bullet point on here. And he says, my thoughts are, given a choice, given the limited number of choices, I would say, no, I'm not Black. No, I'm not Asian. No, I'm not Native American. The closest thing to who I am is white because they don't offer me brown. And so Ricardo complicates things a little bit, right? He says, well, he builds sort of on what Suzanne was saying, where she's saying she's not Black, and she identifies as white, but she's not really white. And he's saying, well, that's who the closest thing I am is white, right? So he's sort of bringing himself into that white space and accepting whiteness as an identity, but he's only doing so because the sort of particular identity of brown is not available. One thing I want to note, though, is that in both of these statements, Suzanne and Ricardo, we see that they're overtly sort of distancing themselves from Blackness. They don't feel as though it's an available identity for them. And when we look at Liliana's statement, which is the next third bullet point here, we'll see a little bit more of that. She says, I guess they see dark skin and they associate it with you're not from here, which is, again, so weird because I'm not African American. I don't speak for their race, but I feel like they're accepted as Americans. You don't go up to one of them and be like, are you from Africa? Can I see your papers? So here with Liliana, we see a little bit more of an overt pushing against Blackness, right? And an overt sort of distancing from Blackness, and almost to the point where, while I don't think she was necessarily attempting to do that on purpose, to push back against Blackness and distance herself from Blackness, and also to necessarily even say that Black folks have it somewhat easier. But what she was sort of doing, it was sort of happening with this, is she ultimately was distancing herself from Blackness in her sort of naming or calling out of African American community, and sort of implying that there is a slightly easier sort of automatic recognition of their eligibility as citizens in the United States. And this is part of a larger conversation that I had with Liliana, where she talked about how she conceptualizes citizenship as being tied to whiteness and Blackness. But for now, one of the things that I really want to identify here with these racial identity narratives is that a lot of the time, the Mexican Americans that I interviewed ended up purposefully or implicitly distancing themselves from Blackness. And one of the reasons that I found this to be the case was because I felt like they didn't have an understanding of the ways in which their racial histories and their racial identities and their ways of knowing about those identities were apparent to them or presented to them. And so one of the things that I wanted to sort of look to understand why that might not be available to them as a racial sort of narrative and a racial identity narrative is to look at something that does represent that racial historical narrative for Mexican ancestry, Mexican American people in Texas in particular. And so I turned to the Tejano Monument as a source for collective memory. And in particular, I found two things happening with the Tejano Monument. I found that there was a narrative of Tejanos as white in the various plaques, and there's also sort of an elision of African ancestry or Blackness for Tejanos in the narrative of who Tejanos are, and also in the larger sort of historical contextualization of Tejano history. Excuse me. And so what we see here is I'm presenting you with a photo. This is the front of the monument. I'm not going to get into too much detail just yet on that, but I did want you to have a good sort of view of it, because I have another slide and it's a little bit harder to see the whole projection. So these are the 5 plaques that are in the front of it. They're in chronological order, starting from 1519, ranging all the way to the 20th century. And they are a brief narrative of Tejano history in these time periods. Now, one thing that's not here, I had a slide about it, was the monument itself was created to be a representation of Tejano historical narratives. They specifically said that on the website. This is actually a picture of the map where it's located. It's in the southeast corner, central corner of the Capitol grounds. And so this is the first interpretive plaque, and this sort of illustrates one of my main points about the narration of Tejanos as white. And I know that I'm a little bit over time, so I'm going to be quick here. One of the things that this plaque does is it particularly focuses on whiteness by stating that the first sentence of the first plaque says, Tejanos are descended from the Spanish explorers and colonizers who settled Texas. So it, right off the bat, the interpretive plaque locates Tejano history and Tejano identities with Spanish colonizers. And I think, you know, what this does is that this amounts to a centering of white histories and a privileging of whiteness in Tejano history generally. And so what we have here is then I'm showing you again, that centering. How is that centering or focusing on a white European ancestry happening? Well, if we look at this, the conquistador, who's at the very top of this, it's a tiered granite base. And we see the conquistador is at the very top of that base and elevated above all of the other statues on the base. So we have a Mexican vaquero and a family of Mexican peones. And we see that the conquistador is at the very top looking off into the distance. So there's a very sort of purposeful and overt heightening or elevating of Spanish ancestry. Finally, my last point is that at no point in the representation of the figures or in the plaques or even on the website is there a mention of Black or African people's role in the formation of Tejano racial identities and histories. Bonilla Silva, a sociologist, notes that those who are closer to what he characterizes as collective Black tier of the racial hierarchy in the United States are less likely to garner the privileges and resources associated with whiteness. And in the creation of a Tejano history that elides the presence of Blackness in the racial history, this serves to bring Tejanos closer to whiteness and its ultimate resources. Now, again, all of this is occurring. What's really important here is that all of this is occurring despite scholars such as Deidre McDonald, as I noted here, saying that Africans have been present in the Americas since the 1400s in the Caribbean, and as well are known to have been present in Texas as early as the 1600s. And I would think that some scholars might argue even sooner. Now, just to quickly conclude, what this means is that Mexican Americans' conceptualizations of their own racial identities, they often narrate them as white or brown. And that's largely because I would argue that they don't have a connection to their historical and epistemological sort of identities. They're not able to draw on those ways of knowing about who they are. And that's largely because of the representation and the larger sort of systemic obfuscation of those particular histories. The second point I want to make in this conclusion is that epistemics of Blackness are ignored in the historical narratives of Mexican American ancestries. And so I think it's really important to think about how Blackness is directly tied to Mexican American ancestries. And I think that some of my colleagues on this panel will probably be elaborating more on those things. But you know, it's simple as pointing to our cumbias to even hear, we can physically hear that African ancestry in our culture, in our cooking, in our everyday sort of lives. And then finally, there's a history of centering whiteness and white supremacist epistemics that has led to an inability for Mexican Americans to conceptualize their racial, cultural, and ethnic selves as African descended. And so here, the reality is that if we keep these historical knowledges from ourselves, or we purposely sort of hide them, or the systems sort of the educational systems or governmental systems continue to mask those things, we are no longer going to be able to connect ourselves to those parts of our racial and ethnic identities. That's all I have for today. Thank you all.
Thank you, Daniel. Just wanted to make a note that Daniel and I went to grad school together, and I think we took a lot of the same critical race theory courses. So yeah, there's a lot here that hold on, let me go ahead and find. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next speaker. So Sylvia Mendoza. Dr. Sylvia Mendoza is going to go ahead and Sylvia, are you with us here?
Yeah, let me share my screen.
There we go.
Okay.
There we go. So let me go ahead and start with Sylvia here. So Dr. Sylvia Mendoza is going to be talking on La Prieta 2021 Reflections on Colorism from the Texas Borderlands. She was born and raised in Yanaguana, San Antonio, Texas. She's an associate professor of Mexican American Studies in the Department of Race, Ethnicity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Her research interests reflect her deep personal and professional commitment to locating and centering the histories of Chicanx communities that have been erased and or misrepresented within the larger narrative of Texas history using women of color, feminisms, and Chicanx, Latinx feminism research methodologies. So I'm gonna go ahead and welcome Sylvia to, I think you're up and going now.
Yes, everybody can see me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. Let me start my timer. Okay. My name is Sylvia Mendoza Viña. My pronouns are she, her, and ella. I was born here in Yanaguana, San Antonio, Texas, and I'm currently at UTSA. And the title of my presentation is La Prieta, after Gloria Anzaldua's essay. And I really am sitting with what it means to return home to San Antonio, which was the site of some woundings in regards to colorism on behalf of my own experiences. So I'll talk a bit about that. So before we begin this presentation, it is necessary to acknowledge that this presentation on colorism and Blackness within Latinx communities is taking place at the same time and is tied to anti-Blackness and the continued violent murders of Black people in the US and globally. It is important to honor and acknowledge Dominique Lucius, a 26-year-old Black transgender woman who was a fan of the show Empire, who was remembered by loved ones as fierce, glam, and gorgeous, who was violently murdered on April 8th. It's important to acknowledge Dante Wright, a 20-year-old father of one, who is remembered by loved ones as goofy, funny, and a fan of music, and who was violently murdered by Brooklyn-centered police in Minnesota on April 11th. It's important to acknowledge this moment and this panel presentation that is comprised of non-Black Chicanx Latinx folks theorizing on colorism and Blackness without the presence of Black folks on the panel and in the midst of intense grief and mourning for Black lives. It's important for us as non-Black Chicanx Latinx folks to have these discussions and to work through our confusions that will help us to divest from whiteness, which I'll talk briefly about in this presentation. However, it's also important that at the end of our theorizations that we return to the urgent and pressing matter of engaging in these conversations and moving in the world in ways that support, affirm Black life. It's important to acknowledge that this presentation will mostly, my presentation, will mostly involve reflection, critical questions, and no concrete answers. This is a presentation by a non-Black Chicana for other non-Black Chicanx Latinx communities. My reflections come from my experiences having taught Chicanx studies and Mexican American studies in Texas and California, from conversations with colegas and comadres such as Dr. Sandra Garza, whose research examines colorism within Mexican American communities, as well as my own experiences as a Prietita, growing up and attending public schools here in Texas, which has our own brand of white supremacy. It's also important to acknowledge that Black feminists, organizers, scholars, communities have been addressing these issues for centuries, and that we must engage and read their works. And I acknowledge that I still have so much to learn. And so these are some folks that I have been drawing from and sitting with and processing. And I'm happy to share these references with anybody, but I wanted to include them. So the presentation is titled La Prieta, and it's coming from the essay written by Gloria Anzaldúa, which was featured in this bridge called My Back. And essentially in the essay, she's grappling with what we're grappling with here. How do we collectively dismantle white supremacy while affirming the various ways our bodies, our skin color, our size, our phenotype, our facial features, our hair, our sexuality, have been constructed as a result of colonialism in ways that materially impact us in very different ways every single day. And so I draw from Manzo Dua because she situates the work within the self, right? So what does it mean to have to sit with these questions on your own as a way to create social change, right? And so from her essay, I wanted to include the subheadings because the subheadings are just so deep, and it's the necessary work that we need to do to really engage in a process of unlearning coloniality, right? It very much still lives within us. And so see, these are some of the subheadings and some of her processes that she's going through to address colorism and bridge building. How do we bridge with each other through difference? So she begins with a subheading, where did it begin? The pain, the images that haunt me. How did we learn to internalize these messages about Blackness, about ourselves? Where does the shame come from? Who are my people? Which is one of my favorite questions and something that I'm sitting with in this moment. She recognizes the transformational potential of women of color feminisms. And she asked, where do we hang the blame when it comes to white supremacy, right? And again, looking into the self. And then she envisions a world where we might fit, where we might not have to deal with these constructions that doesn't currently exist, but if we imagine it, we can move towards it. And I also want to connect this, because this is very much related to her concepts of theory in the flesh, right? What can we learn? How does the body teach? How does the body teach and learn? What can we learn from our skin color? And it just so happened today that Dr. Sarah Webb, who is a scholar of colorism and who has a website called Colorism Healing, she actually presented a couple of questions that I think are relevant for this discussion and that I will engage with and I'll ask you to sit with too. So she asks, how did my attitude about skin tone develop? What people, media, incidents, environments shape my thoughts and feelings about complexion? And this is very much speaking to Dr. Delgado's work as well. How has my attitude about skin tone manifested in my words and actions or in my lack thereof? Why does my reflection on this issue matter? How will understanding my attitudes, words, and actions about skin color change things for me personally and in my family or community? And so I'm really sitting with these questions. I'm really sitting with La Prieta. I'm sitting with returning home. And there are two things that are very heavy for me in this moment as we do this presentation. And the first is the sort of shame that I do have for us recognizing the evil genius of white supremacy that has us so confused about who and what we are and how to access our history. I'm very much sitting with that, especially in the midst of Black death, right? And the second thing I'm sitting with is returning home at this point in my life and recognizing that how I wish earlier on, and this absolutely, I'm so grateful for Dr. Delgado's work, how I didn't know that loving darkness or loving Blackness was an option. Because having been a product of Texas public schools, having been born and raised here in Texas, the goal and the training and the messages that you receive everywhere is lighter is better. And I think even as a young person, I never truly believed that if I was lighter, I was better. But I did know my life would be easier. And there were many moments where I desired an easier life, right? Or I desired not having to feel like I needed to lighten myself. And that could be like literally taking family advice and like not being out in the sun too long, or in some ways trying to whiten my body by making it smaller, right? As a woman of color, finding proximity to whiteness in that way. So I'm very much sitting with that question, which has been presented by Black feminist scholars for a long time. And so I'm thinking about this strategy of aligning to or being seduced with whiteness and the ways that it still manifests within non-Black Chicanx Latinx communities. I'm struggling with this idea of even brownness, right? And I love that Dr. Delgado's research talked about this, like, is brownness and also mestizaje, is that hurting us and Black folks collectively? Is there something that we're not imagining yet that might be more liberatory for us to engage with? Some of the strategies that are accessible to us as non-Black Chicanx Latinx folks are white supremacists, right? They do align and uphold white supremacy. I think about this in my experiences with higher education, having been in school for so long. I think of the ways that I've been mentored that really support respectability politics, right? They don't disrupt the fact that playing the game involves like being close to whiteness. It doesn't make any space for dark folks. It doesn't make any space for Black folks to play the game. But I also recognize that sometimes in these violent spaces, that's what's available. but how can we undo that? And how can we move away from whiteness and start choosing something? Not interrogating our successes, our advancements, which oftentimes are in relationship to whiteness, right? I experienced being on the job market for a long, long time. And I do have to sit with and grapple whether colorism was a part of that, right? So I think that's something that's sort of the inner work that Ansel Dua and Dr. Sarah Webb is sort of presenting with us to do. Latinidad as a whole, there are Afro-Latinx scholars who write about canceling Latinidad from their specific positionality. And I think about that when I see panels that oftentimes are very beige in terms of like the representation, or even departments when going in the job market for jobs, right? Oftentimes the Latinx representation is still aligned with whiteness in terms of reproducing colorism, it seems. Of course, the way that colorism manifests in our families, especially around babies and young children, there are still very much that caste system discourse that exists within our communities that absolutely has to be checked. And even for myself as a professor, how do I reproduce respectability politics or playing the game in my mentoring of students, right? Am I seeking out a particular type of student that it's easier for me to mentor because they have an easier time of going through the pipeline? Or am I making sure that I'm engaging in practices that are rooted in what Cynthia Dillard calls darkened epistemologies, right? And so I wanted to end this presentation with bell hooks, who talks about loving Blackness as political resistance. And I really want us as non-Black, Chicanx, Latinx folks to sit with what does that mean for us, right? Especially given Dr. Delgado's research. What does it mean for us to, and as she says here, the logic of white supremacy would be radically undermined if everyone would learn to identify with and love Blackness. And for myself, I wonder how differently my experiences would have been if I had known that that was an option for me earlier on, instead of thinking I always had to choose to or find some way to be closer to whiteness. I really wish for myself and for other folks that you could just say like, screw that and roll with something else sooner. Although I recognize, the complexities in terms of like the legal strategy of identifying with whiteness within our communities. But now that we're here at this point, what does it mean for us to divest from whiteness and choose something else and actively love Blackness? Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. And no, I think that that's a really important point to make about loving Blackness, and something that I think we don't really embrace a lot. So let me see here if you can switch your, I think you're still sharing your screen, Sylvia. Let's see. There we go, thank you. So now we're going to move on to our last panels, and these are going to be a combined presentation here. It's going to be with Dr. Valerie Martinez and Kelly Rosa Governor-Colomero, who's going to be presenting here. So let me go ahead and put them on the screen here. Let's see here. So Val, I think we need you to share your video.
I think I'm gonna share mine first, I think.
Okay, hold on. We need to get Val. Valerie? You need
Yes,
to share
yes,
your
yes.
so,
Sorry.
so I can pin
Yeah,
you.
no, Kelly's gonna go first.
Okay. All right. Go ahead then, Kelly. I'm gonna go ahead and read your bios though. Let me start with Kelly. So Kelly is a Chicano dancer, musician, a teatrista, performer, activista, and first-generation scholar from Santa Ana, California. She counts with a long record of community activism, social justice, and involvement in traditional music and dance. She received her MA in Bicultural Studies from UTSA, focusing her research on the roots, practices, and survival of San Jarocho, as well as Chicanx identities. She is a professor of Mexican American Studies at Northwest Vista College, a multidisciplinary teaching artist, and facilitates free community talleres at the Tallercito de Son, using Son Jarocho as a tool to create a space for Chicanos to research, document, and give voice to this Chicano experience in the US. So let's go ahead and welcome Kelly.
Gracias. Thank you so much, Doctora Mendoza, for saying a lot of the things that I was going to say. So I won't repeat them, but I definitely just wanted to kind of call attention that we are non-Black Chicanas, Chicanos, Chicanexes talking about anti-Blackness. So I really, really de todo corazón appreciate that, Dr. Mendoza. So what my compañera Valeria and I are going to talk about today is solidaridad, combating colorism and anti-Blackness in the classroom and the community. So I guess I'm just going to take my time to share kind of how I do that in the classroom. I teach Chicano fine arts, Mexican American fine arts at Northwest Vista here in San Antonio. So next slide. There we go. So I always start my class, regardless of what I'm teaching, whether it's, you know, an intro class or the arts class, with what is colorism? And I always use Dr. Garza's, I think she's here, shout out to Dr. Garza. I always use her article, right? And we'll read bits and pieces of it. Sometimes we'll read the whole thing, but I also tie in Las Castas, which is this caste system. And it's always so interesting to me because I feel like sometimes we assume that our students know things, but they don't. Like maybe they feel them or they have this like, oh, I've totally felt that. Or, you know, they've had their parents say like, quédate afuera del sol, no te metas mucho en el sol, right? Like stay out of the sun because you're gonna get really dark. And so we kind of start our class talking about identity. And I just, you know, come out the gate talking about colorism. And I always use this quote from Dr. Garza's article. While colorism is complex, it generally refers to the ranking of individuals based on skin color and racialized physical features such as hair, eyes, nose, buttocks, and even hands and feet. And I feel like as soon as I share that with my students, all of these like, oh, right, like everything connects and they start to understand that. And we even look at the you know, the actual paintings, like the old Spanish paintings of the caste system. And then I use a lot of art, music, videos in my class, right? I'm a fine arts teacher. It's kind of goes with the territory, but I love using the Black grandma in the closet. Some of them will watch the whole episode, but we definitely watch the first like 30 minutes where Professor Gates explores this unknown, right, history of Blackness in Mexico. And I think it's, you know, the title comes from something that one of the people he's interviewing says, where, you know, the person says, it's like I had this grandma, this Black grandma hidden in the closet. And so I just kind of use this as an introduction to talk to my students about these things that they've probably felt or had inclinations about, but never really understood, right? And I feel like, you know, they get to see, it's a really short documentary, it's on YouTube. Feel free to shoot me an email, I'll share it with y'all. But he does it in a very creative way through, you know, what some of the other amazing panelists were talking about, through food, through music, through language and things like that. And so we really look at that, you know, how does that affect us today? And we'll look at current media. Like I'll do this thing where I'll show them like different Spanish media people and I'll be like, is this a white channel or like a Latino channel? And they always get them wrong, right? Like they always get them wrong. And so we start to engage in this discussion of colorism from a place where I feel like my students can meet me at. And then I talk about the three raíces of Mexico, right? Because I feel like in order to understand anything Mexican American, we have to understand the Mexican part. And so, you know, I use son jarocho or music as a way to kind of, as Dr. Carmona was saying, it's like a heavy topic, right? To engage with. A lot of students get real emotional. They often feel attacked. They feel like they've been, you know, it's just a hard thing to deal with. And so, you know, I use music, I use son jarocho to talk about these three roots of Mexico, right? I'll talk about African slaves, and then I'll say, you know, I don't even like the word slaves. They were philosophers, they were doctors, they were medicine people, and they were brought against their will, right, by colonizers. There were thousands of indigenous people with different practices living all over the coast of Mexico where the Spanish arrived, right? And then I talk about the Spanish colonizers and sort of all of the different influences they brought with them, which I saw some people talking about in the chat, right? But I really talk about the African sort of influences, and I go into music, and then how, you know, Chicanos in the 80s and 90s started identifying with this music too, and being able to use it in that way. And I wanted to show you just a little bit of a video of son jarocho in case y'all are like, what is she talking about? I'm not gonna show the whole thing. I'm just gonna show a few seconds of it. So hopefully it works. to share a little bit, right? And I'll break it down with my students. We'll talk about the phenotypes, right? Like the physical features of these people from Veracruz. We'll talk about the instruments and, you know, where did that quijada come from? That was the jaw that you saw, the cajon, the polyrhythms from Africa. And so we're really able to create a dialogue while using something that any student can get into, right? Like I'd rather talk about music any day, but really we're starting to talk about this sort of secret or untouched or rather undiscussed sort of third root of Mexico. But then I always have students that are like, let me skip the slide. Muy bien. Then I always have students that are like, that's so like hippie though, profe, like that's so Mexico. So then I start talking about like, well, solidarity has been happening between our communities since back in the day, right? And I'll be like, what about the 1960s? Like, especially right now, it's super easy because there are so many films out about Black Panthers, right? About Huey Newton and all of these things. So I'll start pulling up pictures like this and I'll be like, well, let's talk about these things. And we'll talk about the solidarity that existed between the Brown Berets and the Black Panthers, right? And I'll show them these photographs and then I'll show them photographs like these, right? Where huge Chicano leaders that we learn about in our classes like Reyes Lopez Tijerina, right, is here with Dr. Martin Luther King, right, before his big march on Washington at like a planning session. And so showing that our communities have always been in solidarity together. And then that leads to discussions on, well, how come we don't know that? And why is that left out of the narrative, right? And then we start looking at artwork, because again, I teach fine arts, right? And so we'll start looking at how Chicano artists starting in the 1960s and continuing all the way into the 2000s, right? How they were able to create third world solidarities through liberation, right? So I like to show this one of Vietnam Aslan by Malakais Montoya, right? This pretty, I think a lot of Chicanos, a lot of people who study Mexican American studies have seen this print, right? It says, you know, fuera, out of Vietnam, it's solidarity, it's in Vietnamese and Spanish. But then I also show them this. So this is from a really amazing event, a Chicana Moratorium event in Oakland. And they recreated the Malakais Montoya piece that you can see here at the top. But this happened the same year that Trayvon was shot. And so it says, a struggle in the ghetto is a struggle in the barrio. And then it says, yo soy Trayvon, right? And so I'm able to show my students how these solidarities have continued and how artwork has played a role in that solidarity, right? I'll show you guys. Here it was, San Antonio Park, Sunday, August 25th. It was, I believe, 2015 in the Bay Area. So they were celebrating the Chicano Moratorium, which is something a lot of us teach our students. And here's some of that. Then I show them stuff that's more recent. This is a piece from Dignidad Rebelde, which is one of my favorite Chicano art collectives out of California. And what they did is they put together this amazing graphic poster, and you could download it for free so that you could take it to all the marches and the rallies. You could put it in your classroom, and just showing the power that art has to not only create solidarity, but to create awareness. And then lastly, I'll talk about the ways in which my students can sort of create solidarity here in San Antonio. It's really hard right now because of COVID. But usually, you know, these are some things that myself and some local teachers, along with some of our students, did at La Printeria, which Harvey Mireyes, an amazing nonprofit here in town that is always working to help the comunidad. And we were able to print thousands of these Black Lives Matters prints and this George Floyd, I Can't Breathe print. And we were able to raise money for a lot of the groups here in town that were fighting for, you know, a lot of the people that we've lost here. And so, you know, just showing my students how you're able to be in solidarity and how we've always been in solidarity, even if you know, people would have them think otherwise. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Kelly. Now we're gonna switch over here to Valerie. So we go ahead and go while she sets up her.
Thank you.
Give me
I have a
one
lot
second.
of, let me see.
Let's see.
Yes. Okay. So,
Hold on. Let me go ahead and go through your bio real quick.
oh yeah, sorry.
So Dr. Valerie Martinez, she specializes in 20th century Mexican American history, U.S. military and labor history, and women and gender studies. Her current project, Embajadas, Latina Servicewomen and Hemispheric Politics During World War II, reconceptualizes traditional notions of diplomacy and international actors by investigating how the recruitment and service of Latina women in the Benito Juarez Squadron during World War II embodied the Pan-American ideal of imagined hemispheric system of unity and reciprocity in the Americas. She is also the co-recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities grant to create an oral history project dedicated to women veterans. Dr. Martinez is currently an assistant professor of history and the history program head at Our Lady of the Lake University at San Antonio. Yes. Go ahead, Valerie.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you to my fellow panelists for your amazing presentations and for setting up the context for me. And thank you, Dr. Carmona, for inviting me to be present on this panel. So I come to you today as a historian, but also as a member of Nax Tecaspoco, where we advocate for ethnic studies, including Mexican American studies and African American studies, and hopefully soon Native American studies and later Asian American studies. So I come to you here in this position, recognizing the solidarity that must continue, right? And as Kelly has explained, we have to continue this legacy, right? So what Kelly and I again have been really working on are what we do in the classroom. So thankfully, we have the other fellow panelists, Dr. Delgado, Daniel, and Dr. Mendoza, Silvia, setting up again that context for understanding these theoretical ideas surrounding whiteness and colorism and anti-Blackness within the Latinx community. So what Professora Cabunok and I have done is, again, we're sharing with you today our strategies that we have used in our classroom. And I love Professora Cabunok's her use of this artistic elements, right, of artwork, and I'm also trying to use primary documents, including other music, and so we're trying to, you know, again, as Professora has explained, engage with our students in different ways. So what I usually use these for, and the classes that I've kind of engaged students with have been through traditional U.S. history classes, so the first and second half primarily. I really engage with this in my second half, so my 1302 U.S. history since 1865, but also use this within my Mexican American history class, which stretches back to, we look at the pre-colonial era and then, you know, kind of bring it up. So you can use this in multiple classes, you know, however you want to use it. There's ways that you can integrate this into several different courses. But we really look at these questions that the other panelists have really kind of theorized. So we look at what is whiteness, what are the wages of whiteness, right? What is colorism, what is anti-Blackness, and how have these items been internalized in ourselves, within our families and communities. And now, if you're using the basic periodization of U.S. history, I use Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty textbook, and I'm really able to do this through these different periods, so through these different chapters, beginning with Reconstruction all the way to the present. So you can, you know, most definitely disrupt the periodization of regular U.S. history, but if you're following along through a textbook, it is really easy to integrate a lot of these questions as you go through these chapters. So, for example, if we're looking at how have these items been internalized in ourselves and families and communities, I too, as my panelists bring out, we look at popular culture. So I'm going to see if I can bring up, as for example, the novelas, right? These different novelas. So I don't know if y'all remember this one, but Triunfo del Amor, this one was one of my favorite ones. But I asked them, okay, as your grandmother's looking at this novela, or you, or your aunt, your mom, whomever, in your class or at home, who are the main characters and how do they look? Right, just bringing something out to them. Who are the criadas, right? Who are the maids? So we look at this and they're thinking, oh, you know, I hadn't thought of this, right? I hadn't thought of these, you know, these beautiful faces and how that beauty or conceptions of beauty is very much connected to whiteness, right? So, you know, I just kind of bring those up, or how conceptions of beauty, even within their own families, for example, are brought up when a baby is born and then the grandmother's like, ah, qué bonita esta güerita, right? Or of how in your own families, someone has said, oh man, I wish she didn't come out as dark as me. I wish she came out lighter like her dad. So there's ways that you can engage with these students, right? By personalizing these issues and really engaging what this means. So I'm going to show you a different way. So those are just kind of like basic questions and things that we kind of do, which is to kind of open up these discussions. But I really look at different points of discussion, and I look at different litigation, right? I look at these processes of litigation. So I wanted to show you, for example, of how this would look on a chapter outline. So for example, this is when we were looking at this this kind of post-war period, okay? So here, and this is chapter 24 of, again, Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty. It's called An Affluent Society. That's the chapter title. But I look and I try to explain things, again, through these litigation or and court cases, essentially. So this was just a kind of an example. I'll get to these court cases here later on, but if you're kind of wondering what does this look like on an outline, this is kind of what I use. But going back to these early cases, so you can look and begin at, I mean, really, we saw how Professora Cabanuk looks quite earlier, and Dr. Mendoza also, and Dr. Delgado, I love how you brought in the Tejano Monument. I love those. Those are brilliant ideas. So if I'm looking at, my 1302 class, I really look at, and this is a little bit pre-1302, but I still bring this in, but I look at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And there's this really great website, okay, and I have it here, where it shows the document, but it also has the English and the Spanish translations. So I really focus on articles 8, 9, and 10, where we're looking at these connections of whiteness to citizenship status, right? So I think it's a really great way where students can really see this of how people of Mexican descent were supposed to acquire US citizenship after a year, right? After a year's time. So we talk about this, okay, so then after that year's time, what does citizenship mean when, unfortunately, through, you'll see in Article 10, when land was supposed to maintain within these, ethnic Mexican hands, how is it that the Land Grant Act of 1850 is able to take this away when they were supposed to be quote unquote American citizens? So we connect these ideas and look at citizenship and whiteness. And this continues, and I'm really indebted to several different scholars, and here on this sheet here, several scholars, and this list is by no means exhaustive, that really make these connections. So of course I'm indebted to Martha Menchaca, Natalia Molina, May Nye, Laura Gomez, David Roediger, George Lipschitz. We know George Sanchez, Arnoldo de Leon, Zaragoza Vargas, Sandra Garza, Alice Walker, right, her 83 on colorism, Ibram Kendi, Thomas Guglielmo. I mean, all the list goes on, right?
I'm gonna join
So
another
again,
meeting, okay?
oh, so again, you can most definitely pull from these. So again, a lot of these scholars have looked at the connection between citizenship and whiteness. So another case that you can really look at is the infamous Rodriguez case, right? Now, several scholars have pointed to this case as the case that whereby Mexicans are recognized as legally white, right? So I have here where you can actually look at the monument, right? The monument here in San Antonio, whereby this case is so monumental and will set the stage, right? And this case is really argued first in 1896, the same year of Plessy versus Ferguson, right? So you can contextualize that, again, as you're going through this Reconstruction period, contextualize Plessy versus Ferguson with the Rodriguez case, right? And where Rodriguez is applying for citizenship, but he is not recognized as white or black. The two groups, right, in 19th century of the color line, right, in the 19th century ideas of color, he's neither. So we see that this case, again, is this monumental in connecting to ideas of citizenship as equaling whiteness, essentially. And then you can move forward and look at the Immigration Act of 1924 that sets these racialized, these quotas based on race. And we see here of how people of Asian descent are barred, right, are essentially barred from US citizenship. So here, again, it's having students really think about where this comes from, right? Where there's these ideas about whiteness and connecting it to ideas about citizenship. Now, in terms of education, and this is coming from the outline that I showed you for looking at this post-war period. Now this gets really, really tricky, because here I want students to again contend with these strategies of whiteness that our predecessors used, and how that pitted us against the Black community, right? So I really want them to see if how these our early predecessors in the civil rights era are using notions and strategies of whiteness to gain access, right? So we look at a couple of these different cases. There's a really great PBS special. It's about an hour long. I included the link in here that you can show if if you have the time, or you can have students look at it off, outside the classroom. But these two others, I have Mendez versus Westminster, Delgado v. Bastrop, and I have a couple of others. So I included this link, and it's a Google Drive, and it has all of them kind of laid out there for you. And I got those resources from it's from Mexican American Voices. It's a documentary readers from 2009, but I still use these. It's really, really good. So I included the chapter on La Causa. So that way you can have access to these primary documents and really, have students understand again how whiteness was used as a strategy. So as we move forward, I show students as, okay, so if this is where Mexicans are legally white, and then this is how it's being used as a strategy, and how it unfortunately pitted us against the Black community, there is still time for racial coalition building, right? There's still these movements, as we've seen, of interracial, again, coalition building. So we see how these strategies shift. Okay. Oh, and sorry, one more. I do also talk about Hernandez v. Texas. Now, again, we're seeing this recognition within the Mexican community of, while legally white, they're being treated as a class apart. So that whiteness strategy again starts to unravel, and we see it finally here by the 60s and the 70s. Now, the artwork back here is by Shazam Malik here in 2020, and she is really looking, when she's saying brown is beautiful, she's looking us at her Indian American identity. And this one in the background, Black is beautiful and it's so beautiful to be Black, this is from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It's a pamphlet from 1967. So we see how, again, those shifting strategies are happening by the time we hit the 60s. And I have pictured in the background Guadalupe San Miguel's book, Brown Not White. It's a brilliant book, again, of showing of how those strategies of whiteness were used against the Mexican community, and how at this point here, when we're getting to the 60s and most definitely by the 70s, folks are claiming I am brown, not white, right? So again, it's a different way to show these different types and moments of solidarity, but also of how that shiftness and whiteness changes. And there's also, if you're bringing it to kind of, looking at it today, if we're making students and encouraging them and forcing them to contend with these ideas and how we have internalized these ideas, we can turn to the 2020 election, right? And I know there's several articles right now that have really looked at how and why, for example, in South Texas, there's a large contingent of people, Latinos, who voted for Trump, even though Trump and his anti-Mexican, anti-immigrant rhetoric, right, is still, and a lot of these articles have really tried to understand these continued ideas in connection to whiteness, right? And how this privileged positions when you try to enact this white identity will give you access that other folks cannot, right? So I really encourage students to understand these different ideas. And another way is through music. So the Learning for Justice has a really great podcast of good playlists, but a few that I've used are these, and I have them pulled up, but one that we most recently used in a series that were creative on inclusive pedagogies, and I had them all kind of pulled up here, included the song by Keegan Bryant. Now, we use this as a way to connect, because I come from a faith-based institution, Our Lady of the Lake University. So we used it to connect, to see how spirituality and faith connects with racial and social justice. So we can, if we have time, we can play them. But all these links, I have them for you. So here's the link for the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Here's the inscription for the Rodriguez case. I also have the link again for the Lemon Groves documentary. It's about an hour long. And then this clip of A Class Apart, I use a lot of trailers in my class to really get just a snippet, just a little taste of these things for students to become hopefully interested and engage with them. So as far as assignments go, I use the TCU Civil Rights in Black and Brown Oral History Project. Students conduct their own oral histories where they contend with these ideas about colorism in their families, with ideas about interracial marriages. Students have talked about their parents. So, but if they cannot conduct an oral history, they've used these oral histories here again, all trying to figure these things out. And I think it becomes a really engaging project for students to actively interpret and try to analyze this material. So I know I'm trying to quickly get through it all. And one last bit that I wanted to show was the new, and this came out about a day ago, so I'm really happy that it kind of came out. So here's where Biden is going to make the historic census director pick with Latinx statistician Rob Santos. And he made this really great comment about how we are identifying. So here he says, when I fill out the census form, I check the Latino, Hispanic, Mexican American box. When it comes to race, I mark other and insert mestizo because that's how I feel about race and ethnicity. I think it's important that we now have these conversations and that they're coming at these top levels, but it's important again to engage the students with these conversations at this kind of micro level and within the community, as Profesora Gabonocas has examined or has explained. So thank you all for listening. And again, I'll have this link for everybody so that way you can engage with some of these resources that I have listed, and hopefully they help in your class. And I look forward to listening to how other people have talked about these issues in your own classes. And maybe we can start some type of this Google Drive, right? Some type of a folder where we can share resources, because I'm always looking for new ways to engage. So thank you again.
Thank you, Valerie. I'm going to go ahead and, if you want to stop sharing the screen there, turn it over to questions from the audience. We do have a few. Let me go ahead and spotlight here. So I'm going to start with the questions that are in the box first, and then we can kind of go on to questions that you guys would just kind of come out and say, I can ask as we do this. So the first one we have is from Linda Jimenez. Are you with us, Linda? Or did we lose her?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Well, my question had to do with how it is that it was for Dr. Delgado. It had to do with the depiction of Tejanos as being white when and how the role that Tejanos played in the Texas independence struggle, which essentially was a struggle to maintain slavery, and how that impacted or influenced that desire to be white.
Absolutely. So that's a great question. That's a really good question. I think it's consistent, I would say, unfortunately, and I think that's your point, right? Is that it's pretty consistent with what
Precisely.
we see with regard to the sort of creation of the historical narrative around the Tejano monument. And I think, unfortunately, and there was a good comment in the chat about, the sort of Spanish ancestry being a more ancestry of Moors who are essentially who we describe as Black folks today, right? And so I think that's really interesting that you would sort of bring that up, because I do think that it, unfortunately, for Tejanos and for the history of Tejano identity, there is a clear sort of desire or sort of narration of Tejanos as white. And I think there's always been a move toward, that's why we see Tejanos taking on the Tejano identity, right? Even though, Go ahead.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Were you going to
No,
say?
I was just gonna say it's very similar to what the Hispanos in Nuevo Mexico do. You know, they say that they're not Chicanos, they're Spanish, or they're not whatever, they're Spanish. And the truth is that by the time the Spaniards got up to where up here, they had already been a lot of interracial mixing, and so you really didn't have a whole lot. There weren't very many pure Spanish. There were, pues ya eran mestizos. You know, it was not. You can say that all you want, but it really wasn't true.
Yeah, and for me, I think one of the big things that I was trying to sort of get us to understand is that that complexity, right, bring us to this point where if we're narrating any of the histories of Mexicanos or Mexican ancestry peoples, and my fellow panelists have touched on this much more than I did, but we're
Yeah.
narrating those things, creating historical narratives around those things. It's super important that we recognize that it's not just sort of indigeneity. It's not just Spanish. It's not just or a mestizo, mixing of those two, but it's also that Africanness as well.
Yes.
And I think with a cautionary sort of recognition of phenotype, I would say, and not being able to just sort of latch on and say, yes, we're Africans without really being existing in the world that way, but at the same time recognizing that we do sort of have that history as part of who we are, and it did certainly shape how we're going to be interpreted. Myself as a light-skinned Latino.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. All right, the next question comes from Dre. Dre, are you with us? So I don't know if Dre is with us, but I'll go ahead and read out the question. And this kind of opens up to the whole panel here.
Yes,
do you think
I'm here.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, I would just have a question, like the focus of the groups that you were working with. Do you think that the racially identified is situational? So being in one situation when they have maybe, I don't know if I should say like complications of how to identify in that moment. I'm not white, I'm Hispanic, I am Hispanic in one group, but then when I get in another group or situation, I'm going to go ahead and identify with white because I'm closest to that group that I'm in at that moment. Do you see that as being the case?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dre, and you're absolutely right. I think that there was a situational component to their racial identities and the way, and it was contextual, right? It was driven by the particular context that they were in. But one thing I will say is that, I brought up those sort of narratives of how they would sort of push themselves toward whiteness when there were particular sort of material costs for identifying in other capacities. And that was sort of what the sort of larger issue was, is that if there's a material price to pay, they're going to move closer to whiteness. And, what we've sort of seen with Latinos, especially lighter skinned Latinos, is that we have a tendency to be sort of, oh yeah, we're Latinos. And then in the next moment, when there's an actual cost for us to identify as Latinos or dark or in solidarity with our darker skin, family and friends, right? We sort of move away if there's a material cost for it. And so that's sort of one of the things that I was trying to sort of unearth here, is the ways in which that was happening. And I didn't put it in here, but I actually had a few respondents talk about family members who used derogatory terms that were directed at African ancestry peoples and even at Mexican ancestry peoples. They would use those terms and even though they were the same ancestry, they would say those words to distance themselves from them. There's a lot of that practice going on. So that's a great question.
Thank you.
So we do have a question from the audience, Galan. So I think if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, everybody. I'm Francis Galan, and I'm a history professor at Texas A&M University, San Antonio. Glad to see some familiar faces. Hello, Valerie. Hello, Daniel, and a bunch of other people. And my last name, Galan, there's an accent on the second A, and that's a term you hear throughout Latin America, referring to somebody who is someone's lover, if you will. it's interesting that all the presenters, it was just great. This was probably one of the greatest panels I've ever seen put together. And the fact that you have a title, History Has Eyes on You. And specifically, I just want to make a couple comments and then the question for Kelly, actually. And my wife is from Laredo, all her family from across the border, Nuevo Laredo. And when I've been down there with friends, I'm El Güero. And on my wife's family, the Delgados in Nuevo Laredo, she has first cousins, one who is simply referred to, they call him Güero, and the other first cousin, they are also Delgado, as Prieta. And I thought to myself, how awful that you refer to your own cousin as Prieta. So it's just very visible, very present day, just as you all talk about. But this history of mestizaje, Kelly, and the casta paintings that were drawn largely in the 18th century by the artist Miguel Cabrera, who himself was described as mulatto, so someone of color. And it became a kind of genre for the elites back in Spain to have these paintings, you know, like we would have paintings in the present day of certain artwork from the past. But I thought that was really fascinating, your discussion of the casta paintings. And in my own research on looking at slavery in Spanish Texas, you have terms of slaves described as de color quebrado, which means literally broken color, or somebody who is of mixed race. You have somebody described as color moreno, color morisco, meaning Hispanicized African of some sort. But to try to bring it to the 20th century in the modern day, you also made me think about the game that we play a lot here at our house, Loteria, and how it almost seems like is it kind of like from your perspective, a casta painting? Because you have El Apache, you have El Negro, you have El Güero, and El Güero is a sharp-dressed white man, El Negro dressed as a servant, El Apache who looks like he's representing the savage from the frontier. It's almost like just frozen in time. So I thought maybe you might comment upon that as well in terms of Loteria, which you play as a kid.
Sure. It's so funny because I feel like that is something that my students usually get on like the second day of class. And then they're like real quiet about it. And then like 2 or 3 weeks later, they'll be like, profe, and they'll just want to have this like explosive talk about everything. Like they'll start talking about, like they'll bring up the Loteria cards a lot. They'll be like, ay, profe, now I'll be like with my family and my tia's all, El Negrito, and I'm all, tia, like maybe we should say something else, right? And so what I always talk to my students about is like, I use those moments to have very difficult conversations with my family members in a way that might not be so difficult, right? And I also talk to my students a lot about like, you know, sort of I'll share with them like, well, here's a problematic loteria, right? Exactly, Dr. Garza, that's where I'm going. But then I'll share like, here's a great loteria by queer artist Felix, right? The Aeon, who, it's not like a whole game, but it's like loteria cards that are really awesome. Also, there's an amazing loteria in Nahuatl. There's an amazing loteria that's son jarocho based, right? Where it's like all grabados, prints, yeah, stamps, like prints that are on a card. And then all of the verses are like son jarocho verses that are often tied into like African legacies. And so I use, you know, anytime my students, like loteria comes up a lot. Another one that comes up a lot is like, you know, people just, what we've said, like being called prieta or being called like güera or these different things, right? And so I think what I always try to do is exactly what Dr. Garza did. Like when something problematic comes up, I try to be like, but look, we've advanced. And there's these other versions where people have realized like, this is problematic, right? Like, this is problematic. And, you know, I think if we can look towards this new thing, that is also something that I think, you know, supporting local artists and supporting what they do. And I think, you know, being able to, what I do always encourage my students to do is use those moments to have the hard conversations with their families, which some of them do, and then they come back like super angry at me because it goes poorly. Right? But some of them come back like really empowered and like feeling really good about themselves because it went well, right? And they start having these dialogues around the kitchen table that they normally wouldn't have. And I think, you know, that's a huge success for me. If I can just get my students to understand that colorism is very real and that it impacts our everyday life, and then they start critically thinking and recognizing those things, right? And even if it's just, you know, sitting with it in the discomfort of like, I don't know if I even want to play loteria, and having those, you know, Dr. Mendoza was talking about a lot of Gloria and Saldua, right? And having these like inner sort of like conflicts and discussions with yourself, like, well, what does that even mean to navigate? Someone else was talking about like navigating different spaces with different identities and whatnot. And so like, what does that mean to be a Chicana professor, but also to have to go to the West Side and play loteria with all the señoras from church? And how do I navigate these spaces? And how can I come from a place of love and understanding that they're my elders and that I want them to come to a place of understanding without, you know, being disrespectful or things like that. And so I really just try to encourage my students to have the hard conversations, and that sometimes they're not like, there's not going to be some big like tan tan or like moment of like cathartic. Sometimes it's just gonna be like poopy, and you'll just be like, man, this is dark. And I'll be like, yeah, it is, right? But that's part of the work that I think Dr. Mendoza was also talking about, like just sitting in it and being like, feeling it, and what does this mean, and how can I, as an individual Chicana who's not that light but not that dark either, right, and who's definitely not Afro mestiza or Afro Chicana, how can I just try to create a space for my students to have the hard conversations that they need to have?
Thank you.
So I do have one question in the chat, then I'll go to Deanna, who had a question with the racing. So go ahead, Cyrus. Cyrus, did you want to ask your question? Is Cyrus with us?
Yeah, sorry, I was just doing something else. Really, my question was toward Dr. Valerie Martinez, and I recently did an interview for my history class about COVID and all that, and throughout the interview, we kind of touched on Latino and Mexican culture and how it probably influenced the votes for Trump. And I was wondering, do you think multicultural is something that kind of helped toward the vote for Trump and for the Latinos and Latinas down south?
Oh man, I saw that. I saw maybe that was you, because I saw that in the chat as well of how much has that contributed, right? And
Yeah.
I think that masculinity most definitely has definitely played a role. So there's something that so those components that we were looking at, if we're looking at whiteness with citizenship, we can also add in masculinity, right? How whiteness is also equal to masculinity. So in one of my classes, we look at race, gender, and sexuality and how that has impacted American wars throughout the 20th century. So beginning, you know, from the late 19th up until the 20th century, of how that most definitely has influenced. So I think issues of manhood and masculinity most definitely have played a role. And, you know, I read so many things on, you know, Facebook is a great source because people are passing all these amazing articles here and there, but I need to find a way where I can save these articles, because I know someone posted something and I wish I needed take better citations, you know, or screenshot or something. But they are most definitely looking at that connection of how this sense of perhaps a lost masculinity, it could have been maybe perhaps due to being furloughed or unemployment, and how this loss of sense of masculinity has been found in a figure like Trump.
Yeah.
All these different adjectives were playing in my head. I thought, you know what, this is recorded, I better not. So as toxic, we'll stick with the you know, as toxic as Trump. Okay, we'll make this PG and not curse, right? But yes, so I do agree. I do agree that masculinity has played, and other scholars have looked at how it's played a huge role in even issues such as war, right? And looking at how men have tried to reclaim this sense of lost manhood or masculinity, and they reclaim it in different ways. It could be through a vote through Trump. Yeah, good question.
So I want to go ahead and ask, I think Diana, you had your hand up if you want to ask your question. Diana, are you there?
I think she said it was an accident in the chat.
Okay. All right. So I do want to have a question that did come up in there, and let me go ahead. So this is for Sylvia. I think this is a question. I don't know. I've lost it in the chat here. But anyway, so they asked you about when was the first time that you recognized your darkness as compared to other members of your family. Yes.
I always associate it with school for some reason. And I don't know if that's because of like Dr. Garza's article, Decolonizing Intimacies. I don't know if I internalized being called Prieta or dark as an intimacy within my family. So it didn't feel like immediately aware. But I know for sure when I started school, I would have other students sort of do comparisons, right? Like, why are your knees darker? And I'd be like, oh shit, why are my knees darker? And I didn't have an answer for it, right? It's just my body. And so I think schooling definitely placed like an emphasis on it. But if I reflect from this point, like absolutely it was in the family too. The fact that my nickname was Prietita, or like the jokes that we would have with siblings, right? They said that I came from like the chocolate milkman, like silly things like that you grow up with, but they're terms of endearment, which I still struggle with. Because ultimately what ends up happening is that I cultivated strategies that again tried to lighten or try to protect myself or try to make myself safe, right? So I struggle with folks saying that, you know, we consider it terms of endearment because I didn't get to have a full sense of safety, whereas lighter skinned folks in the family, they could access that because they were always, I don't want to say better, but they could be louder, right? Whereas I think my mom also wanting to ensure safety would be like, well, you shouldn't do like that, or you shouldn't go out too much, or you shouldn't get darker, or you shouldn't, right? So I don't think I had access to this level of safety as a dark skin as a dark skinned child because of perceptions of that, which is sort of like limiting. Whereas I think my sister or lighter skinned folks in the family, like those things weren't things that they had to consider or had to hear from adults that loved them, you know? So yeah, definitely early on. And I know Sarah Webb talked about that too today when she listed those questions. She said she knew early on, she remembers as early as 5 or 4 saying like, oh, it's because she's light skinned. I think that's important because oftentimes we leave it to parents of color to do this work, but really we need like lighter skinned folks and white parents to be doing this work too, so that dark kids, Black kids don't go to school and get terrorized just for existing in their bodies, right? But yeah.
Okay, thank you, Sylvia. I think we have a question from Dragan. You want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was just going to comment, and also, yes, I do have a question for Sylvia. I also, in my family, is very large. We have a French background. My last name is Andre Point. And we have so many shades of color in my family. And anti-Blackness is a big issue, even to this day, and I'm 51 years old. So even to this day, I still struggle with it, but I went like the total opposite. I was that kid that was gonna stay in the sun and get as dark as I can, just to piss everybody off, you know, because I couldn't change it. You know, it's just how I was. So, but my question was, there's many Black people, especially females, that experience this on a daily basis. Have there been any conversation between Latinos and African-American women on this same conversation, almost like comparing the notes, just to show that there is that connection also not talked about, you know, that we have those same, deal with those same issues and in school as well. And as a collaborating together with those issues, we'll be able to eradicate some of those feelings toward Blackness in those institutions. So have there been any conversations like that?
That's what, and I learned about this through Dr. Sandra Garza, but Dr. Sarah Webb, who has the Colorism Healing, she has an Instagram account and a Facebook, and she also does this writing contest. And so those questions that she gave, like that's a prompt, and she solicits essays from everybody. So she'll get Asian folks submitting, she'll get South Asian folks submitting, right? Since coloniality impacted the entire globe, you'll have like South Asian folks talking about like skin lightening creams, or you'll also have Asian folks like Filipinas who are darker talking about like how the mom would purchase these creams and come home and tell them, you know, like you should use this on your face, even though it was, you know, bleaching creams. So I think that her work and her site, I've seen that comparative, and I feel like she welcomes that too. She's a Black woman, but I think she's also welcoming exactly what you said, like, look how this impacts so many different communities, and in particular, women and women of color, because we have Eurocentric standards that are held to us in regards to beauty and our worth, right? So that's where I've seen so far. I don't know, Dr. Garza, if anybody else has seen anybody explicitly making that cross connection.
Yeah, specifically between Latinos and Black people. Margaret Hunter's book looks specifically at Mexican American women and Black women, and takes a lot of data and analyzes, then compares. It's a really good, it's a good place. You know, there's a lot of more current work. I'm going to put a link in here. Definitely Sarah Webb's work that Dr. Mendoza keeps bringing up is a great place to go, because Dr. Webb also put together a resource guide. It's just got everything ever created on the issue of colorism, skin color consciousness. It's just a really great resource. I'm going to go find that and plop that in the chat too. Brilliant talk, by the way, everybody. This is brilliant.
Thank you.
Yes, I was going to call on you, Sandra, because this was originally you were supposed to be in this panel because of your work.
I'm sorry,
Yes.
but I'm sorry because look at, and I kind of feel like I was, because thank you for the shout outs and the hat tips throughout the talk. This has just been excellent.
I just wanna,
Dr. Garza, we're indebted to your work on this. So like whatever you're hearing from us, just go straight to her article and then it'll be all there.
I've been taken aback, but no, we're in it together. We're in it together. Brilliant work.
oh yeah, I just want to say that I first got introduced to Sandra's work was I was on the dissertation award committee when we awarded her the dissertation award for, and her work is just was so brilliant, and it has been because there's not a lot out there on the work that Sandra's done, and so so if you haven't read her work, please look it up, because it's extremely important. So I do have, I think, one more in the chat from is it Vanessa Justice? Did you have a question for the panel?
No, I'm so sorry. Was my hand up?
I think so. Sorry.
No, thank you. I'm just listening. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. So Jessica Rangel, do you have a question?
Yes. Sorry, I couldn't find the hand.
Okay.
This is a question, honestly, for any of the educators. I started NBC here, or I started at the Alamo Colleges. Actually took Dr. Garza and Maricela Barrera, who completely changed my life taking school. I'm 36 years old and decided to go back to school. Anyways, my question is, how is it possible that, you know, I come from a town 3 hours away, Conroe, Texas, went to Lone Star Community College. How is it possible that still today, you know, we're not that far apart in distance, yet these courses are still not being offered back home in my community? And it really, you know, anytime that my younger generation talked about going to college and going to Lone Star, I almost, want to hesitate for them to go, because I had such a terrible experience there, because I never was given the guidance never given the advising that I needed to. Being a first generation Mexican American, going to college by myself, zero help, and never really finding that passion. And I will say that I found my passion I've always had a passion for language arts, right? But first time reading a Mexican American author was at NBC in 2020, and I went to college in 2003. So, I mean, I always I'm like, what do I do to go back to my community and get these courses going for my people? So how is this even still a thing?
Hi, I want to say, no, girl, yes. No, yes, I feel like that's a very common experience for a lot of my students. I teach at NVC, right? And so I feel like I was saying earlier, I have this first day on like, what do these terms actually mean? Like, where did the term Latina come from? Where did the term Hispanic come from? Where did the term Chicana, Mexican American? Where did the term Latinx come from? Which is very different from Latino, Latina, et cetera, right? And my students come back either really mad at me, but then we work it out, or they like have this crazy like, oh my God, I don't know my identity my whole life. My mom would tell me to check the box. And so I think, one thing I will say is that several people in this chat have been fighting really hard to get these classes at the high school level, like really hard. And something that I always tell people when they ask me that is go to your school district and demand that they put this state board approved class, a history class, a 36-week year-long class, right, to put it in the curriculum, and not as an elective, right, but as the history class that it is, right? And so I think that's one great way to start, is by, organizing parents. I always teach my students that like, sin los papás no hacemos nada. Like without the angry moms and tias and grandmas who like come through, right? And we're there at school board meetings from all over the state, if I might add, right? And so I think one thing that I always feel so helpless, but then I see now, like I get to help write curriculum for that class. I know several of the people in this chat also help write curriculum for that class. And it's a class that we're starting to see at every high school in NEISD right now, at several of the high schools throughout San Antonio, several of the high schools all over Texas. And those students are going to catch that fire, that fuego that we all caught in our 30s in grad school, or, coming back as a non-traditional student. They're going to catch it at 17 and 18, and they're going to demand those courses in their colleges, right? And then hopefully, right, it'll just be like this snowball effect. But I always say something that you can do is start writing to your school board, start getting your parents organized and your high school students organized, and demand, because I guarantee you there's a teacher at every high school willing to teach the class, because they're just so passionate about Mexican American studies. And so, I know that's like a daunting task, but it really could start as easy as going to a PTA meeting or going to church. I always get the señoras at church. It's where they go, right? And just being like, hey, I want to talk to you guys about Mexican American studies. And I even have a zine I can share with you that has like information on that, but really trying to get the class at the high school level so that our students expect it at the higher education level, no matter where they go, whether it's NVC, whether it's Lone Star College. Yes, Valerie we have a website. Valerie put the website there. We have an Instagram. We have all that stuff. We have, Knox, Foco, Texas, which is like our yearly local Texas thing. But definitely there's also like curriculum stuff up there. If you're an educator and you just want to do like a lesson, like the one I did, I think mine on Son Jarocho is in there. And there's all these different lesson plans. So, I definitely, I think, Jessica, trying to get that class that we all fought so hard for, and people before us fought so hard for, because we stand on the shoulders of our, other people, just trying to get. And it's not just the Mexican American studies class. There's an African American studies class. I think they're about to pass the Native American studies. We're working on an Asian American studies class, right? Dr. Carmona can talk all about that. But I just, I think getting these classes that we fought so hard for at the high school level so that our students expect it in higher education, so that they're not like us at 30 having some like midlife, oh my God, Gloria, tell me more because I didn't know, right? And so, just giving them the opportunity at 16 and 17, what we didn't get until our 30s.
Thank you.
So yes, do we have any last questions that you might want to ask the panel? Let's go ahead and shout it out. All right, then. So before we go today, I just want to thank the panel. You guys did a great job. This was a really, I think, informative. And everybody, I think we had a lot of questions, and I think this is one of those subjects that is difficult to talk about because we have not talked about it much. And so just want to see if I want to give the chance to the panel to just say one last thing before we go today. So I'll start with Daniel. Let's see if he has one thing he just wants to say before we go.
I don't have much to say, but I do want to thank everyone and say that I appreciate all the amazing comments and the supportive comments. It's very sort of, it's nice to hear that, but I do think that for me, I think, I created a course on Afro-Latinos, and one of the things that I do in that course is I do talk about the critiques of mestizaje. And I think that it's one of those things that I think when the students are learning in the Malex classes, the Mexican American, Latin American studies courses that we have, when they're learning in those courses about mestizaje, they also are getting a dose of the critical sort of perspective on it. And I think that's an important juxtaposition to be having because of the anti-Blackness that can be sort of woven into some of those discussions of mestizaje. And I did want to sort of bring that out. We didn't really get a chance to talk about that, but I do think that I know some of you might be doing that work in your own research and in your own classes. So I do appreciate it, but I do think it's something worth sort of talking about as we move this discussion further.
Thank you, Daniel. All right, Sylvia, do you have one last thing to say?
I'm just so grateful to everybody for sharing space and building community and being open to this very vulnerable conversation where we have to air out our own internalized stuff as well as our family, right? And so I'm just so grateful for everybody for showing up in that way. Thank you so much, and thank you for organizing.
Thank you, Sylvia. All right, Kelly.
I just, I want to say thank you too for creating space to have these really hard conversations. I know some people asked about slides. I put a link for my slides in there. So it has like the link for that video I used and the information if you wanted to use that and my contact information. If you ever, one thing if nothing else, please do not be afraid to use the arts when you're talking about these very difficult subjects, because you would be surprised. And I mean mixed media. I mean, I use music videos, spoken word. I use all kinds of things because you'd be surprised how much you can get your students or your family even. Like the other day, I got a Facebook message at like 11:59 from a former student talking about, can I get the link from that one video? Because I want to show it to my prima because she's talking a hot mess right now. And I was like, partially, I was like, girl, it's like 11:59. But I was also like, oh my God, it's working. Like she was a student from like a year ago. And so, just the power that these videos and this artwork and getting students to just open up in ways that they might not if you didn't have those things there. So really just, if you need resources, reach out. I've got tons of artwork just compiled on every subject by Black and Brown and Indigenous artists of color. So, I always want to make sure people do not be afraid to use artwork. I feel like so many educators are, but just reach out. We got stuff for y'all. Definitely though, artwork. Use some artwork. And thank you so much to Dr. Carmona and all of the panelists. I feel like I'm like the junior entre los grandes. So thank you so much, y'all, for being in community with me.
So before I bring Valerie on, I just want to let you know that this is being recorded and it will be put on YouTube, and I'll share it on my Facebook and everywhere so that you guys can have this. So you just look it up in History Has Eyes on You, and we have a channel so that you can just find, this is the 6th one, but yeah, so this is going to be recorded. This is recorded and it will be put up probably tomorrow, and I'll go ahead and share it. All right, Val, what is your one last statement from you?
Yeah, so I mean, Kelly's talking about how she's a junior. It's like, no, man, but your activism, dude, your activism is on fire, y'all. So a lot of these people here, Dr. Garza, I mean, Chris, Dr. Carmona, I'm so used to using our first names, so I'm sorry. We worked hard for these, so I'm trying to, but it's hard to still get used to. But everybody has worked hard, and I'm thankful to you all for taking the time to listen to the panel. So when Jessica asked, was talking about, why don't we know this yet? And and we're trying to give you information about how to do it in the high school level. It's like we still have work at the college level too, right? So I know it's just work all around. Everybody, no, there's no rest for the weary. So everybody's got to put in their work to get this done, right? But in terms of the college level, for our specific university, Our Lady of the Lake University has graciously allowed me to put on a critical pedagogy workshop series that we've had for this past year. And I invite you all, we're actually having another one coming up tomorrow. It's during the lunch hour, 12:30 to 1:30, and then we have a syllabus redesign workshop that comes on Monday. But I'm gonna make a nice kind of, I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna make a nice something to compile all of these different workshops, because we've talked about how to use an anti-colonial lens. I gave that presentation back in October, how to use an anti-colonial lens in your classroom. Dr. Candice Cepeda has talked about how to use anti-racist pedagogies. Here on Thursday, we're gonna have Dr. Rosalind Evans talked about using a non-binary, right, promoting non-binary pedagogies and strategies. So we've spent the year trying to compile this, and it's open to the public, and it's a Humanities Texas sponsored project. So we definitely want you all there, students, educators, people who engage with students. I mean, out there in the community and whatever level, we want you to come here so we can continue these conversations, because we have to do better, right? We got to do better for our students. We have to do better for our community. We have to do better for this nation, for this world. I get really disillusioned sometimes. I get really just down by a lot of this, okay? So we all got to do our part, right? We all have to play our own role. So I welcome you to continue these conversations, to continue your own activism, and I encourage you, and I stand in solidarity with you wherever you are. We're there. So exactly, si podemos, right? So thank you all again. Thank you, Dr. Carmona, for this great invitation. Thank you to my panelists, and thanks to everybody. Si podemos.
So yes, thank you, Valerie. And yes, your work has been really helpful for everything that we're doing here. I just want to do one last bit of information before we go here. So we have HB 1504, which is House Bill 1504, which is the Ethnic Studies Bill. Right now it's in committee, and it's going to be voted on tomorrow to get out of committee. And when it gets out of committee, the plan is it goes to the floor, and when it goes to the floor, we can really start to advocate for it and do a campaign to get it approved. And that bill itself is calling for the teaching of ethnic studies courses such as Mexican American studies and African American, and of course we have Native American studies coming up in a year or so, in lieu of world geography or world history. So that'll be the first bill that's really a step in the door for getting more ethnic studies into our schools. And so that is going to be on the floor, and hopefully Representative Cristina Morales is the one who put the bill forward. And so she's confident we have the votes to get it out of committee. And if we do that, then we are on the floor, and we can advocate, and we can lobby all your legislatures to make sure that this bill passes. And so this is a big achievement if we get this thing out of committee into the floor. This is the first time we've had an ethnic studies bill make it this far. So, so just want to make sure that we'll be informing everybody about the bill when we get the final word in tomorrow. And then of course, we're going to start a campaign to make sure this thing passes. But I just want to go ahead and thank everyone. This was a great panel. And I think, we're going to have more of these conversations as we move forward. But thank you all for coming tonight.
Thank you. Valerie, I just have a quick thing to tell you. Catherine Anderson told me to tell you hello. Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you. Yeah, she's one of my colleagues. So come to the
Yeah.
talk tomorrow. We love to have
Yeah.
you. Sign up and we'll see you tomorrow then.
Yeah,
Continue.
actually I am. I'll be there
Yay!
tomorrow too.
Great.
Yeah.
Everybody. I'll see you tomorrow.
Okay, thank you
Right.
so much.
Thank you. Appreciate you.